Welcome, everyone, to the President's Lecture Series. We have an extraordinary speaker today, but before I introduce him, I also want to express my deep gratitude to the Office of the President of the University of Montana. You all probably know we have a new president, Royce Engstrom, who has expressed his strong support for the President's Lecture Series, and I believe this is a great way to kick off the next generation of the President's Lecture Series with an extraordinary speaker that I will introduce in a minute. I also want to recognize Richard Drake, professor of history, who's over here. He's hiding here somewhere. Where is he? Give us a wave. Yes, thank you, Richard. Richard Drake. Woo! Professor of history has organized this lecture series for at least 2 decades, perhaps longer, and it's gone strong for another few decades. This is something that's unique to the University of Montana, and those who reside in Missoula may not realize how unique it is. Very few universities have had the caliber of speaker and the quality of discourse that we achieve through the President's Lecture Series, and it's all down to Richard Drake. Can we have another hand for Richard? Woo! It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for tonight. Stephen Prickett is Regius Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Glasgow and an honorary professor at the University of Kent at Canterbury. From 2003 to 2008, he was the director of the Armstrong Browning Library at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He took his BA and PhD at the University of Cambridge and a Diploma of Education at Oxford University College before teaching in Nigeria from 1963 to 65. And I want to pause on that point because Stephen Prickett is truly a global scholar. He has taught at many locations around the world, and he is a researcher who has a cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural interest, and that will emerge from the next things that I say. From 1967 to 82, he taught at the University of Sussex in England before moving to the chair of English at the Australian National University in Canberra. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He's a former chairman of the UK Higher Education Foundation. He's the former president of the European Society for the Study of Literature and Theology. He's also a fellow of the English Association, and he holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Artois in France. His publications include 1 novel, 9 monographs, 7 edited volumes, and over 90 articles on Romanticism, Victorian studies, and related topics, especially on literature and theology, including books entitled Coleridge and Wordsworth, The Poetry of Growth, published in 1970. Romanticism and Religion, The Tradition of Coleridge and Wordsworth in the Victorian Church, published in 1976. Victorian Fantasy, published in 1978 and frequently reprinted. This is kind of a paperback book that you carry with you on the train and read instead of comic books. It's a very engaging book. He also edited a volume entitled The Romantics, published in 1981. Another incredible book entitled Words and the Word, Language, Poetics, and Biblical Interpretation, 1986. And we're just getting started. It's a long list. He also published Origins of Narrative, The Romantic Appropriation of the Bible, published in 1996, and a book entitled Narrative, Science, and Religion, Fundamentalism versus Irony, published in 2002. One of my favorite books published by Stephen Prickett, and something that I would call the definitive book in its field, is entitled The Bible and Literature, published by Blackwell in 1999. This is a book that anyone teaching a course on Bible and literature must have, perhaps as the textbook for the course. There's no better book in that field. Just recently, his latest book is entitled Modernity and the Reinvention of Tradition, Backing into the Future, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. His most recent book is a world-beating accomplishment. It's entitled A Reader in European Romanticism. This is a multilingual project involving 18 universities in 15 countries, published by Continuum in 2010. This anthology, which is a book with about 1,000 pages with parallel text publication of poems and translations in, as I said, 14 languages. Was just published last year, and it's won the top prize in its field, the Jean-Pierre Boricelli Prize for the best book in the field of romantic literature for the year of 2010. So this is a world-beating professor, and I want to add a personal note. He's been a good friend of mine for a couple of decades, and when I thought about who would I like to invite to speak at the President's Lecture Series, the signature series for the University of Montana, no other name occurred to me other than Professor Stephen Prickett from the University of Canterbury. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Prickett.
Thank you very much, Jim. Have I got sound? Am I clearly audible at the back? The first thing. Well, I'd like to start after that enormously warm welcome from my old friend Jim, who was present at many of the activities that that resulted in the production of the Reader in European Romanticism. I would like to thank him very much for the invitation to come here today, and the President and Richard Drake and all the other people who have been of such assistance and made me so welcome here. So thank you very much. And indeed, thank you very much, all of you, for coming tonight. It's not every time that I find my audience has to struggle through a snowstorm to get here. I hope it's worth it. I'm going to start by showing you a picture, if this works. Oh, yes, it does work. This, as you can see, is a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, and it's Cardinal Albrecht of Brandenburg pretending to be St. Jerome in his study, and painted in 1525. And the question I want to raise, first of all, is why does a successful and obviously very wealthy cardinal in Europe want to have himself painted as if he's St. Jerome? And of course, the important thing about St. Jerome, I know we've got the birds in the foreground and the famous lion and all the rest of it. All the right sort of trimmings are there. But the fact remains, it's a curious thing to want to represent yourself as somebody else. And given the Catholic attitude towards translation in the early 16th century, why would you want to try and represent yourself as a biblical translator when at exactly the same time they are hunting down William Tyndale, who was translating the Bible, the Vulgate, into English? And so you get in this the ambivalence of European Catholicism towards the whole notion of translation at the beginning of the 16th century. The idea of translation from Latin into English, of course, is much earlier than the 16th century. John Wycliffe here is 14th century, and he did not actually, according to the latest scholarship, do much of the translation himself, but he inspired the first great English Bible. It was never completed. He himself died before it was completed. The Lollards, his supporters, were dispersed, and just in case anybody should get the ridiculous idea of wanting to translate the Bible into English, his body was found in Leicestershire, in a village. It was dug up, and his bones were thrown into the River Soar. Being a biblical translator was, shall we say, a risky occupation in the 14th century, and it remained so in the 16th century as well, as we shall see. It was also heavily attacked. Indeed, some critics have argued that the idea of translating out of Latin into English was in itself almost akin to blasphemy. Now, it's also worth noting that there was a man I'm trying to remember his name, Knighton, that's right, Henry Knighton, who lived in Leicestershire at about this time. And Henry Knighton was one of the quickest critics of the idea of biblical translation. And he wrote indignantly, he said, if we translate the Bible into English, we shall have every literate man in the country trying to read it and interpret it. And, he said, what is worse, we will have every woman in the country trying to read the Bible. So they successfully put a lid on that one for a couple of 100 years. But it is worth noting that one of the oddities about the Abrahamic religions, and by the Abrahamic religions I mean, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three great world religions that come from the first revelation of Abraham, all three have practiced their worship in a language that is remote from the language of the ordinary people. As we know, the Hebrews of Jesus, the Jews of Jesus' time spoke Aramaic in their own home. They worshipped in the synagogue, or indeed in the temple, in Hebrew. One might add, incidentally, that Jesus was probably quadrilingual. People who talk about Jesus being a simple Galilean peasant, I think, well, there aren't many Galilean peasants who speak 4 languages. And, of course, as we know from some aspects of the New Testament, he certainly read the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And ask yourselves what language the conversation with Pilate was conducted in. Was that Latin or was that Greek? Now, the quick answer, of course, is that Pilate, as a Roman administrator at the eastern end of the Roman Empire, would have spoken Greek, wouldn't he? Simon Sebag Montefiore, in his latest book on Jerusalem, has pointed out that Pilate was, so far from being a good professional administrator, was totally inept, got everybody's back up, and didn't seem to speak Greek at all. So you can take your choice on that. But certainly, all three religions have tended to try and keep their scriptures back from the ordinary people. No Islamic country in the world now speaks the 7th century Arabic, which is, of course, the language of the Quran. And similarly, until the middle of the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church insisted on the use of the Vulgate as its normative text, though clearly English translations were available from the 16th century, and I may talk about those in a minute. But the whole idea of conducting your worship in a language that is familiar to people is one that all three religions have been very edgy about, I think would be the way of putting it. That is, certainly the Christians, the Jews and the Muslims are much clearer. They have a clear text written in one language, you'd better learn it. The Bible has no ur-text. Our Bible has no ur-text in that sense. It is a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation, written partly, as you know, in Hebrew. Some of it in the book of Daniel is in Aramaic. And, of course, the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, which is a low-status, vulgar language. It's like Creole or something like that. Or a kind of pidgin English. When St. Jerome was asked by the Pope to do a translation, or a new translation of the Bible from what is now called the Old Latin Bible into the Vulgate, he took one look at the texts in front of him and he said, the Greek of the New Testament made his flesh crawl. He then delayed. He was one of the finest classical scholars in the world at the time. Then he had a dream. And he dreamt that he appeared before the feet of Christ in judgment. And Christ said, "What art thou?" And he replied, "I am a Christian, Lord." And Christ said, "Thou art not a Christian, thou art a Ciceronian." And Jerome woke up and said, "Yes, Lord," and got on with the translation. And that is the dividing point between classical Latin and church Latin. The Vulgate is the text that divides the two, made reluctantly by a great classical scholar and reinventing Latin almost as a new language. And that, as we shall see, is a constant process in the translation of the Bible. Luther's great translation of the Bible into German in the 16th century creates the modern German language. And there is a sense in which the Bible I'm talking about today, the 1611 Bible, recreates English. It is at a language that is at one remove from English. It was the language of the authorized version, or the language, we should call it the King James Bible. It was never authorized. But the language of the King James Bible was never the language of the ordinary people, as we shall see. But it exerted a constant how shall we say, gravitational pull on the rest of English in both Britain and in America and throughout the world. But the 1611 translators were not building on nothing. There, before them, lay a great tradition of biblical translation. We have Tyndale's Bible of 1525. Tyndale, you will remember, we'll go on to Tyndale. Where is he? There is William Tyndale, clutching his Bible and looking, I think, suitably wary, as indeed he had every reason to be. He was hounded across the continent, often with half-printed texts with him. He was finally arrested in Amsterdam and taken. They would not execute him in Antwerp, I'm sorry. They would not execute him in the streets of Antwerp. He was too popular a figure. They took him to a castle outside Antwerp, which is what you're seeing there, where he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Mercifully, they strangled him before they cut him up or burned the remains. They weren't always as kind as that to biblical translators. But the process of biblical translation is not one undertaken lightly, wantonly, or inadvisedly in the 16th century. Miles Coverdale is the second great figure in this series. You notice he's working only 10 years after Tyndale, and he completed Tyndale's Bible, basically. He used what there was of Tyndale, and he filled in with the rest. He was a good Greek scholar, but he wasn't a major Hebrew scholar. He drew on others. The next interesting one is... I'm sorry, I've pressed the wrong button. The next interesting one is the Matthew Bible there. That was produced by a man called John Rogers, and he'd got the message about Tyndale. You don't want to publish under your own name. So he called himself Matthew. This didn't actually help him. When Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, came to the throne, she had him burned alive. Meanwhile, of course, even as this turmoil of the Reformation is going on, and Henry VIII, you'll remember, wrote a book in defense of the Catholic Church, for which he was made Defender of the Faith by the Pope, then had a little problem with a divorce, and then decided that perhaps it was a good idea to become a Protestant after all. And those of you who've read Wolf Hall will get the sense that already England was sliding towards Protestantism even without the king, and various people have suggested that Thomas Cromwell was a very skillful manager who was able to control the tide of Protestantism by swinging the court and the royal family across. The Great Bible was produced as a Bible to be read in churches. That's why it's called Great. It was about the size of a modern desktop, more or less. Not a book you would wish to steal, not a book you would wish to carry around in your pocket for private reading. That was the Geneva Bible. Now, with the Geneva Bible, certain substance hit the fan, really, because what happened there, this was under the control of, that was Thomas Cromwell. I will go back in order and deal with some of these people. Where's my hero? John Knox, yes. He is the man responsible. Again, he didn't do very much of the translating himself, but you will recall he was the leader of the Scots Presbyterians, and he organized the Geneva Bible when he was in Geneva. That is the Geneva Bible. I'm going to come back to some of the earlier ones in a moment. Notice that it has both footnotes and maps. None of the earlier Bibles had maps. It was very difficult for people really to understand what was going on in these various stories or where they were taking place. It also had footnotes. Now, footnotes will play a big part in this story. When our friend Tyndale translated the Bible, he produced a number of highly controversial readings. His first big, spectacular hit was the word ecclesia in Latin, which is normally translated as church. Tyndale translated it as congregation. Now, both translations are perfectly good, valid translations. Translation is not an accurate one-for-one art. It is always a matter of changing, altering, replacing. But you can get the feeling immediately. Something that is run by the congregation is bottom up. If there are any Baptists in this room, they will know exactly, or Congregationalists, they will know the power of feeling behind this. A church is something that, at least in the 16th century, is run top down. It has bishops, it has archbishops, it has texts, it has a high degree of political control behind it. And that is precisely what Tyndale wished to avoid. And that is precisely what the Scots Presbyterians wished to have, and what the Anglicans and indeed James wished to avoid. Now, I'm just going to call your attention to something else that is very odd here. This is the first page of the Tyndale Bible. Have you ever seen a more inept piece of typesetting in your life? Just look. It starts off with a paragraph mark for no very good reason. You then have the, and new is in large letters and then split onto the next line. Testament, then diligently corrected. Once again, they've had to split the word, and compared with the Greek by William Tyndale, and finished. Notice they can't even get finished. Any of you with a computer could do a better job than that. And printing after, they'd been printing for over 60, 70 years by this stage, and and Amsterdam was a home of high quality printing. And this is something I'm going to call attention to over and over again. The quality of the print work in this, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as we would say. And that's the execution of Tyndale. That is Thomas Cromwell, who, if we are to believe Hilary Mantel, was responsible for steering England from a proto-revolutionary situation into something akin, at any rate, to a Protestant country, a kind of mid-level Protestant country. That is Miles Coverdale, who actually looks as if he's lost his false teeth, which is a slight problem. But he is another, as I said, one of the great heroes of the translation process. One does wonder, after all, portrait painters were painted to make you look good. One wonders what the original was like there. Here we have the Great Bible, which is the work of Coverdale, Richard, and Grafton. Look at that typesetting once again. It's got wonderful symbolic things. There is the king, now a Protestant, being presented with the Bible. There are the priests on one side, and there are the common people on the other. All kinds of allegorical figures are doing virtuous and holy things all around the place. And then they can't get the typesetting right in the middle. It is quite extraordinary, because the artwork is of very high quality. And once again, what are the printers doing? Remember, of course, what the process of printing was like. It was flatbed printing. You had to arrange the type, you had to arrange the pictures, everything, then press down this piece of paper and so on, and then pick it up. And if you wanted to produce a large edition, you had to have a lot of people doing it. And there are lots of changes and lots of errors. Printing is not an exact process, and the fact that one copy comes out perfectly does not mean that the next one is going to emerge the same way. There's John Knox, that's the Geneva Bible. We're still, up till now, we've been dealing with big, heavy church Bibles. Massively expensive, massively difficult to move, low sales. The Geneva Bible is the breakthrough. It's not in Gothic type, it's in Roman type, which is much easier to read. People could carry it around in their pockets, they could read it at home. This was the backbone of the Reformation in the latter half of the 16th century. Very difficult for Mary Tudor and her, for people searching houses and so on, to discover you could hide a Bible like this quite easily, and so on. It is also, of course, the Bible of Shakespeare, the Bible of Spencer, the Bible of the great Elizabethan writers. It is worth mentioning. Right, here's the Bishop's Bible. Now look at that. The Holy Bible, capital T, but small h, an odd way to spell holy, to say the least, and then a small b for Bible. Oh, well. That's Queen Elizabeth, by the way, being presented with the Bible and indicating that she is great. Unlike her father, she's made herself a good deal bigger. So at least you get the idea, you get the idea who's running this show. And, but you notice she has fortitude and prudence and God save the Queen written along the bottom, in case you haven't got the message there. Somehow you're beginning to get the picture that Bible production was a political activity. And that's exactly what it was. This is the Great Bible of 1513. Oh, we've had that, sorry. Where are we going? John Knox, the Whitchurch and Grafton. Oh, wait a minute. Ah, yes. Now we get to... All that was by way of a preamble, you see, the history of translation. We're now getting on to James's accession in the early years of the 17th century. There he is, looking very wary indeed, and he had good reason to be wary. He'd had endless trouble with John Knox and the Scots Presbyterians. He'd found himself at the center of controversy. He was a ferociously good theologian himself. Being intelligent is not a good idea for a British monarch. Oh, never mind, I will forbear from making any comment at that stage. Elizabeth was very successful and formidably intelligent, but he was also very intelligent and very well educated. He would summon the bishops for theological debates, and he would sit on a dais, on a throne, and then invite the bishops to debate with him. And the bishops, in their full robes, had to kneel at his feet for up to 2 hours while he questioned them on the finer points of biblical interpretation. However, arriving in England, he was petitioned by both Anglicans and by Puritans for various things to do with the church. The Puritans obviously wanted to take the church to the left, to a more Puritan position. There were other Anglicans who wanted to pull it into a much more Catholic position. But the one suggestion he heard from the Puritans, which was a very good one, was that there was a need for a new translation of the Bible. And that was his great concession to the Puritans. Right, we will have a new translation, but of course, it was going to be on his terms. And it was to be headed up by Lancelot Andrews, who was Dean of Westminster. The terms of reference were set out as follows, and these are important. Number 1, the ordinary Bible, read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, to be followed and as little altered as the original will permit. This is not to be a new translation. This is to be a bit of just adjusting of the Bishop's Bible. 2, the names of the prophets and holy writers with other names in the text to be retained as near as may be, accordingly as they are vulgarly used. That's fine. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept, viz. There's the word church, not to be translated congregation, etc. There's a message there. Now, 4, a very interesting one. When any word hath divers significations, that to be kept, which hath been most commonly used by the most eminent fathers, being agreeable to the propriety of the place and the analogy of faith. Once more, we don't want any radical innovation here. We want to reach back. We are putting ourselves in line with a long tradition of translation. But, and running against it, Article 10 in the lists goes, if any company on the review of the books so sent really doubt or differ upon any place, to send them word thereof, note the place, and withal send their reasons, to which if they consent not, the difference be compounded at the general meeting, which is to be the chief persons of each company at the end of the work. And I'll explain that in a moment, because that refers to the whole structure of this translation. Number 11, when any place of special obscurity is doubted of, letters to be directed by authority to send to any learned man in the land for his judgment on such a place. Now that is interesting. Pull in anybody who may know what we need to know. This was not to be a small group working in isolation. It was to be pulling in every scholar in the country if need be. And finally, these translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the Bishop's Bible, that is Tyndale's, Matthew's, Coverdale's, Whitchurch, and Geneva. Now, in one sense, this is absolutely correct. They go back to Tyndale. I didn't do this calculation myself. 82% of the King James Bible is actually Tyndale, an enormous amount of it. But of course, that makes the changes even more significant. And I shall be talking about those changes in a few minutes because they are very interesting indeed. The number of translators. There were to be 6 teams, 2 from Oxford, 2 from Cambridge, and 2 from Westminster. And the controversial bits were all to be given to the Westminster team, who were under closer control of the king. You were not going to let any of the tricky bits get loose. And of course, the interesting question arises, who were these translators? Where did they come from? And a number of books have some very interesting comments. Just let me read you 3 recent comments on the 3 20th century comments on the translators before I talk about them themselves. Quiller-Couch, writing in 1914, says that a committee of 47 should have captured a rhythm so personal, so constant, that our Bible has the voice of one author speaking through its many mouths. Mary Ellen Chase in 1960. Perhaps the greatest of literary mysteries lies in the unanswered question of how 54 translators managed to infuse their work with a unity of effect which seems the result of one inspired imagination. The mystery will never be solved. Gustavus Payne, 1959, writes, how to explain that 60 or more men, none a genius, none even as great a writer as Marlowe or Ben Jonson, together produced a writing to be compared with and confused with the works of Shakespeare. Well, you'll get, they were all in buckram suits, by the way, obviously, but you will get the impression that nobody actually knows how many translators there were. We do know the majority of them. Some of them are merely names to us. My favorite, I have to say, is Sir Henry Savile. He started off, well, he started off as a small baby, but he started off his career as a pirate of the Caribbean. He followed that up. He returned to England, having made a bit of money, as one does, looting Spanish galleons and so on. And he then proceeded to become Provost of Eton College and President of Magdalen College, Oxford. He spoke an enormous number of languages, including, obviously he would speak Hebrew, he would speak Greek, he would speak Latin, but he also knew Chaldean and Assyrian and Ethiopic, which I presume means Amharic, and also knew Arabic, and they were consulting Arabic sources as well. These people were brilliant scholars. No modern committee Modern committees have the strength of archaeology behind them. They have the strength of greater knowledge. They have the strength of biblical criticism behind them. None of them know as much as this particular group knew. And again, I remind you, they had royal authorization to reach out and find, if they couldn't solve a particular technical problem, they had instructions to reach out and find someone who did. And we will talk a bit about the people they may have found for this purpose in a minute. There they are. Which one is Sir Henry Savile? I'm not very clear. But you will notice that in the 17th century, carpets were expensive. You put them on the table, you didn't walk on them. Ah, there's Sir Henry Savile. Oh, yes, something happened to my typesetting at that point. I can't really criticize the other people's typesetting when I get there and I do as badly as that. But it seems to me there's a wicked gleam in his eye still, rather unlike some of the other people, you know. He would have a few, and did have a few stories to tell. But of course, the mystery that many people keep coming back to is how did a group of translators of this kind produce such an incredible prose style and keep it up right across? This is a book designed by a committee. This is a book designed by whether we take 48, 55, 65, or whatever. This is the book designed by a committee. How did they achieve this? And George Sainsbury, writing in 1887, says, "It's curious that such an unmatched result should have been the result of labours thus combined, and, as far as is known, not controlled by any one guiding spirit. No known translator under James has left anything which at all equals in strictly literary merit the authorized version." And Gustavus Payne says, because he was the final critic who looked for flaws and smoothed out the whole translation, there is perhaps more of Dr. Miles Smith in the King James Version than in any other man. But his own style was heavy, involved, and rough. So, quick condemnation. And he goes on, Thomas Bilson, Bishop of Winchester, with Miles Smith, at the end revised all that the rest had done. We may well ask how his style fitted him to burnish the whole final draft, but if we use this criterion, we may ask in vain. Bishop Bilson was for the most part a dull writer. Well, we can go on with this kind of thing, but the method, we do know the method they used. The method was for each member of the team to take a section, to go away and do his own adaptation of the bishop's Bible. And then he had to come back and read it aloud. That's what they're doing in that group, actually. This is not a committee meeting that is sort of gathering for a group photograph. What they're actually doing is reading aloud the particular section. I think it's the man on the far right who appears to have the text in front of him. The rest were apparently armed with different texts, and they sat and listened to him. But it was an oral translation. You listened to the speech rhythms of the whole thing, because it was designed to be read in churches. And of course, remember, this is the age of Shakespeare. This is the age of acting, and church attendance was still compulsory. This was an important event in every village and town in England, the reading of the Bible, and they were determined to get it right. That's Bishop Bancroft. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Another small digression, by the way. Bancroft was a country boy, a miller's son. It is astounding how many of these scholars, Sir Henry Savile was an exception, it is astounding how many of these scholars came from humble backgrounds. It's often easy to imagine that 16th century England, 17th century England was a land of strict hierarchy, a land where the poor but honest lad stayed a poor but honest lad. It is not so. There was enormous social mobility going on, and you only have to look at some of these people to see this process happening. It was, of course, an age when people were condemning social mobility, social mobility, not nobility. But if you find condemnations of something coming out too often, you realize that is what is happening in that society. And this is precisely what's happening here. They were a hand-picked group. Now, they're doing a bit better on this one. They've actually got their lines straight. But once you get down to containing the Old Testament and the New, and there they go into a bit of a mess further down, but it is a huge improvement on earlier settings. Incidentally, the first really good setting of the King James Bible was the first American edition in the 1720s. The American printers made a much better job of it. This was a completely hashed job. It was given to a man called Baker, who was the king's printer. A contemporary who visited Baker's workshop at the time said it was more like an alehouse than a printing works. They were all blind drunk. He found he couldn't complete the contract on time, so he subcontracted it to two other people who seemed to have been nearly as bad. There are 24,000 variations in the first edition of the King James Bible. I call them variations because we don't know very often which is the correct reading and which is the mistake, if indeed there were mistakes. I mean, the thing is just totally confused. Meanwhile, not to be, as I say, it was officially given only to the king's printer to produce it. He subcontracted. Some of the subcontractors started producing editions on their own. Printers in Antwerp realized there was money to be made out of this, and they were running off Bibles with this thing as well. So it's a field in which piracy and fakes are running absolutely riot, and we have no means of knowing when we look at an edition whether we're looking at a genuine one or a fake. You can tell the age. It will belong to the second decade of the 17th century. But beyond that, to be sure, analysis of ink, paper, nothing like that will be accurate. They were stealing each other's ideas, they were stealing each other's forms. Meanwhile, another thing was surfacing. I mentioned the drunkenness of Baker's print house. One of the early editions, Psalm 119, has "Princes have persecuted me." This one read, "Printers have persecuted me." Then, of course, we have the Wicked Bible, which left the word "not" out of the Ten Commandments, ending up with "thou shalt commit adultery." Baker did actually get his comeuppance over that. That was not regarded as a pardonable error, and he was sent to the Tower of London, where he subsequently died. He wasn't executed, he died of a chill, but I think a fairly advanced alcoholism as well probably fairly contributed to this. But so in addition to all these sort of interesting variations that must have crept in that kind of way, we have some acts of what was considered at the time, anyway, to be serious acts of sabotage. How many copies of the 1611 Bible were produced? Again, we don't know, because we don't know which are genuine and which are fake. And to call them fakes, by the way, do you call something that was printed by another printing house in 1611 a fake, or do you not? It's very unclear. And I was at a conference on the King James Bible in Antwerp a month ago, and one of the speakers was saying how that all the copies of the King James Bible are now held in major libraries or major private collections. And there was a man with a plastic bag sitting in row 3, and he said, "Well, actually, no, I've got 3 of them here in my bag." And we all said, "Wow," and he pulled them out. And we said, "Where'd you get these?" And he said, "Oh, you can buy them in second-hand bookshops. You've just got to sort of browse around a bit." We were also told that they were all at the big folio editions to be read in Bibles, the first edition. Somebody else said, no, I've got a quarto. And somebody else said, I've got an octavo version of the first edition. Again, we don't know. There is a great deal of authoritative information given out, and the actual scholarly truth is that we know much less about what was going on there than we're supposed to. We don't know the publication date, by the way. It's often given as May the 2nd, but there's no reason for that at all. Because it was considered to be a revision of an existing translation, it was never properly authorized in any sense and never had an official publication. There were no launch parties for it, there was no champagne, and indeed Lancelot Andrewes, who you saw just now, quoted indiscriminately, for having condemned the Geneva Bible vigorously, then proceeds in some of his sermons to quote from the Geneva Bible and some of his sermons to quote from the 1611 King James Bible. However, having said all the bad things about it, I now want to go on and say some of the really great things about this translation, which do not belong in Tyndale. And the first of the examples I want to take, I think we can find an appropriate picture for this. There we are. That is Elijah being ministered to by a helpful angel. And you'll remember that Elijah organized the massacre of the prophets of Baal and then thought it a very good idea if he ran away as quickly as possible. And he fled to Horeb, the mountain of the Lord. And he came with this report and said, "The Lord said, 'What doest thou here, Elijah?' And Elijah said, 'I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away.'" And you'll be familiar, of course, with what follows. And God said, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, and after the fire a still small voice. Very famous passage. The actual wording, still small voice, is an innovation of the King James Bible, and it is brilliant. The Hebrew is a voice of thin silence. Voice, silence. Was this a theophany? God appeared. If you had been standing just behind Elijah, holding up your iPhone and hoping to get a photograph of what was going to happen next, would you have seen anything or would you not? Or was it a purely internal visionary experience? Now, the whole phraseology of that is designed to stop you asking that question. This was a unique one-off event. And of course, remember in Hebrew, and this is another of the problems of translation, in classical Hebrew, there is no word for nature. And if you have no word for nature in your language, you have no word for miracle in your language, because you can't have a break in something that doesn't exist. Every action, the sun rising in the morning, is the act of Yahweh, of God, performing yet another kindly act, if you like. So whatever this was, the category of miracle didn't exist. But the question of what did happen to Elijah is a very tricky one. And of course, you know nowadays, now the age of miracles is over, they don't happen anymore. Except, of course, that they do. You will recall the famous story of a young nun called Bernadette going for a walk in the Pyrenees and encountering, so she said, the Virgin Mary. She was disbelieved when she went back to her convent, incidentally. But what are we, as historians, to do with that story? You know it's the story of the foundation of Lourdes and the pilgrimages to Lourdes and so on. As modern historians, we have nothing to say about the event itself. It is a singularity. We can merely report that she said it, and some people believed her and some people didn't. That is history. What is also history is that the result of that report altered the road and rail structure of the south of southern France near the Pyrenees, caused a great increase in the hospitality industry, and made a great advances in medicine in the area. That is history. We can comment on that. We cannot comment on the event itself. And in precisely the same way, we can talk about the after effects of the Elijah story. We cannot talk directly about the event itself. Now listen to the modern translations of precisely this still small voice. The Good News Bible, the soft whisper of a voice. No silence there. He heard a voice. Right? Okay, got it. The New English Bible, a low murmuring sound. Well, it may or may not have been a voice, but it was a faint murmuring sound. The Jerusalem Bible, the sound of a gentle breeze. Here is the Catholic Bible going for the most radically naturalistic reading of the lot. But not one of these is going to try and reproduce what the Hebrew said. The King James translators had a theory of translation which said you copy what is said in the Hebrew. And give an extreme example, if the Holy Ghost was going to write nonsense, it was the job of the translators to reproduce that nonsense as accurately as possible and to leave you to wonder about it. All the modern translations have gone for interpretation in one form or another. They've either said it was a naturalistic event or it was a miraculous event. They can't hold the two together at all. And this is actually in the, I know you're a kind and liberal lot in Montana and you don't go in for book burning. But if ever you do hold a campus book burning, put the Good News Bible somewhere on the pile, please. This is from, I read you and I kid you not, this is from the preface to the Good News Bible. The primary concern of the translators has been to provide a faithful translation of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts. Their first task was to understand correctly the meaning of the original. The translator's next task was to express that meaning in a manner and form easily understood by the readers. Every effort has been made to use language that is natural, simple, clear, and unambiguous. Well, that's great, yes. I mean, here they are doing a great service to the reader. What could you object to in that? And then, well, perhaps it's a still small voice begins to occur at the back of your mind and say, since when were the greatest and deepest historical experiences of the human race to be described in terms that are natural, simple, clear, and unambiguous? What would Augustine have said about that? What would Dante have said about that? What would John Wesley have said about that? What would Coleridge have said about that? The thing, it is a quite extraordinary endeavor to simplify the Bible, to reduce the Bible to everyday terms when it's not dealing with everyday events and everyday terms. And theories of translation, of course, at this stage, play a very important part. Behind the Good News Bible lies a gentleman called Eugene A. Nida, who I'm sure is well known to the more clerically inclined people in this audience. And he believed in the theory of dynamic equivalence. He said, anything translated must sound as if it belongs to the language into which it is being translated. So you must make everything intelligible. Now, for instance, take animals. If you don't know the animal, we will give you an animal that looks like an animal that you know. Now, in the case of Eugene A. Nida, he ran into trouble actually with a hill village, a group of hill villages in upcountry New Guinea. When the Bible Society started looking at this particular tribe, they found their only animal was the pig. So they made the logical decision. Jesus was the pig of God. Sorting the sheep from the goats becomes, I suppose, pink pigs from spotted pigs. I'm not sure. But everything was reduced to pigs all the way through. The Gadarene swine, well, that one's easy, isn't it? That's a good one. But you can see where this particular doctrine leads you, in fact. Whereas the translators of the King James Bible believed that if Jesus talked about camels going through the eye of a needle and you don't know what a camel is, you had better go and find out what a camel is. And over and over again, new ideas were brought into English by the translation of the Bible into English. It was one of the great transformative acts in English consciousness and in the consciousness of the English-speaking people that a whole weight of new notions were imported into the society. And of course, we know that many of the phrases of our language have, in fact, come from the King James Bible. The skin of our teeth is one of them, for example. My favorite, however, is the fatted calf. You know in the story of the prodigal son how they killed the fatted calf when the prodigal son came home. And when the translators of the New English Bible in the 1960s came to this passage, they said, well, there's an obsolete phrase, if ever I heard one. You know, we need to find out what the correct phrase is. Long silence. Nobody knew. So they said, well, there's an answer. Let's go to Smithfield Market in London, where they are dealing with fatted calves. So they went down there and they found a butcher, and they said, tell me, what do you call a calf that has been specially fattened up for a particular feast? He said, yeah, Gov, we have a word for it. It comes from the Bible. It's called fatted calf. And so the whirligig of time brings in his revenges. I am running a bit over my time, but I just wanted to draw your attention to two more things quickly. The first is the disarming of the Christmas angels. You will recall in Luke, the angels appear to the shepherds in the field, saying, "Fear not, I bring you good tidings of great joy," and so on. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill toward men." You have sent Christmas cards year after year showing this kind of thing. The Greek is stratias oraniou, heavenly soldiers. And that is Tyndale's translation. And that was repeated by the other translators. We are very lucky in that we do have the notes for the King James translators for exactly this passage. And you can see a sort of creeping embarrassment coming over them. This is 30 years before the devastating civil war between the Puritans and the High Anglicans. The last thing you want marching around England are heavenly soldiers. Cross out heavenly soldiers. They wrote in heavenly army. Well, it's just a bit like congregation and church, isn't it? Soldiers don't have any officers with them. Armies are controlled by officers. They still don't sound good. So they took, remember in the Elijah story I took, it was the Lord God of hosts. The word host was an obsolete word. It had not been widely used in English for some time, and though it originally carried military connotations, it had lost those connotations. And so to this day, I defy you to find a Christmas card in which the angels are carrying weapons when they bring the good news to the shepherds. But that was a deliberate political act, the disarming of the Christmas angels. I can deal with more of these things in questions, if, of course, you have any questions. The other thing I just wanted to call your attention to, because I signalled this briefly, and that is Shakespeare. Of the great Elizabethan writers, only Shakespeare is still alive at this time. And I'm just going to quote to you from Kenneth Grayston, who is one of the translators of the New English Bible of the 1960s, one of the group that went looking for the fatted calf. He is what you might call the Eeyore of biblical translation. The New English Bible does not compare with the Authorized Version, certainly not in language and style. This is not a period of great writers equal to Spencer, Sidney, Hooker, Marlowe, and Shakespeare. Modern English, it seems to me, is slack instead of taut, verbose and not concise, infested with this month's cliché, no longer the language of a proud and energetic English people, but an international means of communication. Well, there's an example of giving up the ghost before you start the struggle. Anyway, the only one, he rattles off this list of people, Spencer, Sidney, Hooker, Marlowe, all dead by 1611. But William is still in his heyday, and he's now moved over into retirement in Stratford. And Rudyard Kipling's last short story, called Proofs of Holy Writ, has Ben Jonson and Shakespeare having a drink together in Stratford when a man arrives hot foot from Miles Smith in Bristol with the proofs of the 1611 Bible. And Shakespeare then, supposedly in the story, adds some translations of his own. And in particular, he picks out, "The ships of Tarshish were caravans for thy merchandise." So the ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market. A lovely poetic phrase. The revised version of the Bible in 1885 says, "The ships of Tarshish were caravans for thy merchandise." The Good News Bible, flat-footed as ever, comes in with, "Your merchandise was carried in fleets of the largest cargo ships." Anyway, Shakespeare. Kipling is not a man to be dealt with lightly. He is a writer who tended to have in his possession information which he had no business to have. He cites, in Puck of Pook's Hill, published in 1906, he cites a well in the wall of Pevensey Castle, which was only discovered in 1936. In Puck of Pook's Hill again, he cites the 7th cohort of the 10th Legion on the Roman wall at a certain point, at a time when historians said that they were based in York at the time. Later excavations showed they were exactly where Kipling said they had been. So one should treat Kipling with a certain wariness when it comes to these things. However, Kipling doesn't mention what may be the finest smoking gun of all. Do you all know about Psalm 46? If you take the 46th word from the beginning of Psalm 46 in the King James Version, you get shake. If you take the 46th word from the end of Psalm 46, you get spear. And Shakespeare was 46 in 1611. If you want to go still further into the problem, Shakespeare was born, after all, on the 23rd of April, half of 46. He managed to die on the 23rd of April, but that was after this, so that's cheating, probably. What's going on? Unfortunately, if you compare it with the Bishop's Bible and the Coverdale Bible and some of the others, what you find is that shake and spear appear at 46, 47, 45, and the same way the other way. In other words, the words shake and spear were rattling around like loose dice inside Psalm 46 long before he was even a gleam in his father's eye. So there may be further evidence on this. We can follow this up perhaps, but I think, alas, the chances are that Shakespeare did not have a hand in it, though it is perfectly possible. They did have a committee. Oh, that's the angel appearing to the shepherds with the multitude of the heavenly host. It's a lovely picture, incidentally, because if you look, the cattle are doing exactly what you would expect cattle to do if something like that appears over their heads. They were not receiving the revelation in reverent silence. They were running like hell for their lives, which seems a more probable... That's Rembrandt, by the way, terrific. Oh yes, that is our friend Herder. Yes, I can't deal with them. That I think sums up the Good News Bible rather well, and tells you its audience very clearly. I'm sorry if there are lovers of the Good News Bible here. They can sort of beat me up afterwards as I leave. And I just thought you'd like that as a final shot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Prickett, for that revelatory lecture. And we are now ready to receive questions. I would ask any questioners to come up on the two side aisles to the microphones and pose your questions. I'd also like to say a few things about the etiquette of questions. Your question should be a shortly phrased question and not an essay in biblical scholarship, okay? If you ask your question in a short and concise manner, we'll have time for other questions. So let's go from over here. Go.
How did the King James Version become the one true translation for some fundamentalists?
A lovely question. Thank you very much indeed. The quick answer is, I haven't the foggiest idea. It became very popular in America, and as you know, fundamentalism started in the United States, in the Niagara Conference, I think of 1895, if I remember correctly. But there's an even more extreme version of this called the King James Only movement, which you may or may not know, which more than 1,000 churches listed in the Bible Believers Church Directory subscribe to this as an evangelical statement of faith. I want you to listen carefully. We believe the King James Authorized Version of the Bible to be the perfect and infallible Word of God. We believe the Bible was inspired in its origination and then divinely preserved throughout its various generations and languages until it reached us in its final form. By this we mean that the Authorized Version preserves the very Word of God in the form in which He wished them to be represented in the universal language of these last days, English. All I can say is this news might come as a surprise to other countries in the world that don't speak English, but I'm sure they ought to know about it. But I really don't know the answer. It is interesting that this happened, isn't it?
I was wondering, do you know what would be the communistic ideas of John Wycliffe, and why was he condemned as a stiff-necked heretic?
Putting it briefly, he and the Lollards, one of their slogans was, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? That they were against the enormous gaps in wealth and poverty that existed at the time. You can call these communistic if you like, and indeed I suppose that they would be, but it was a protest against the excessive wealth and excessive poverty of the period, and in particular, of course, a protest against the excessive wealth of the church.
I'm wondering if we could go back
I've
to
seen this guy before somewhere.
Yes, you have. If we could go back to the slide that's got the John Fox of the execution of William Tyndale, because it's very interesting. You see that as he is being strangled, he is saying, and it's 1536 when this is occurring.
Open the King of England's eye.
Open the King of England's eyes. Now,
Yes.
this execution, it takes place outside of Antwerp.
Yes.
Is that correct? And you've got monks and friars in
Yeah.
the background. Was Henry at all complicit in this? Because
Yes.
he was on the fence at this point.
Yeah.
Wasn't.
I
could you
think the
comment on
general
that?
view is if Henry had really objected, I don't think he would have been executed. It was actually under the aegis of the emperor that he was arrested. But that, of course, as you say, is from Fox's Book of Martyrs, and it's a highly polemical picture. There are the officials of the church gathered round at his execution, and he is praying for the conversion of the King of England.
You forgot my second question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Why was John Wycliffe hated so much and declared a heretic? Apparently they were against this communization of the property, I guess. That's it, huh?
On the whole, rich people don't like communism very much. I mean, it's fairly obvious, surely, that the powers, if you propose a great levelling out between rich and poor, you are going to get a lot of objections from the rich and rather fewer objections from the poor. And it usually turns out the rich are running the country.
Yeah, I found that to be true.
Yeah.
Next question over here.
Hello. You opened your lecture talking about the cardinal that portrayed himself as Saint Jerome.
Indeed.
Could you talk more about the irony of how time changes our perception of should we or should we not be translating?
I am strongly in favor of translation. But I said the irony is that this is the Catholic Church committed to the accuracy of the Vulgate, above all, the primacy of the Vulgate, and yet admiring a translator, even while they are forbidding translation. And this was the irony I wish to call attention to. In fact, of course, by the 16th century, the Catholic Church is getting into the field of translation. It produces the Douay and Rheims versions of the Bible, which were in fact consulted by the King James translators. So this is, but 1525 is right on the cusp. This is the same time as the execution of Tyndale. This is the point at which they are still trying to put the genie back in the bottle. And it couldn't be done. But at the very time when they are suppressing and persecuting translators, here is Cardinal Albrecht having himself painted as Jerome.
Thank you.
I'm familiar with that wordplay in the Psalms of Shakespeare, shake and spear, but I've also recall hearing other speculation about Shakespeare's possible involvement in the translation of some of the Psalms, and I'm curious whether or not you put any weight in some of those speculations.
There is a problem here. It's rather like the Loch Ness Monster. I would love the Loch Ness Monster to be true, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the problems with Shakespeare and the Psalms is that the actual translation of the Psalms was given to one of the Cambridge groups, who were the most Puritan group of the lot, and the least likely to go to the theatre or to admire playwrights. And so it really does make it more difficult. Now, let's be fair, there were Puritans who did enjoy the theatre and did go to the theatre. James, incidentally, loved the theatre, and he interfered so much with the actual production of the Bible that if anybody is likely, I would nominate James as being the man who's playing around with it at this stage. But the fact is, it would be very difficult to put this one across the Cambridge group. John Donne, incidentally, loved the theatre, entered the church, became Dean of St. Paul's. Unfortunately, he was a young man about town writing poems to his girlfriends at this stage and not involved in the church in any way. That came in later.
In your estimation, which current translation of the Bible is the more accurate?
Do you mean of the various versions available?
Yes.
I don't think that's a question that we can deal with very easily, because accurate has many meanings. You cannot really translate one language into another with complete accuracy. There is always a degree of interpretation. And even the American King James Bible, for example, has the word Jehovah in every time when the English Bible has the Lord. These are two different linguistic traditions. English is not one language now. It's a multitude of dialects of languages. You have to ask, which dialect do you want it translated into? And what kind of accuracy are you looking for? Are you looking for faithfulness to the original? Are you looking for theological for an attempt to capture the theological complexity of the Bible? Do you see what I mean? There is a whole range of different questions you might be asking about it. And accurate isn't a word really you can use in this connection. Was Tyndale more accurate in translating ecclesia as congregation, or was Andrews more accurate in wanting it to have it as church? There are political pressures, but scholarly pressures, it's very difficult to say. But you're clearly very different models of the organization of the body of Christian people are going to arise out of these things. And not for nothing do most religious groupings have their own translations of the Bible, which you'll be surprised to learn backs up their particular views.
I would like to re-ask that question because I thought your answer was a little slippery.
I'm doing my best to be slippery, so
All right,
whatever
all right.
I can.
You have taught in England,
Yep.
you've taught in America, and you've taught in Africa. You've taught in Australia. You have a fairly good background in a number of these different dialects. What's your favorite translation of the Bible? The King James perhaps is the first answer, but the
Yes.
second answer, what would it be?
I have to admit, sadly, I like the King James enormously, and I suppose I would take whichever one of the translations seemed to me closest to the King James. And it's as simple as that. It has a subtlety about it, as well as a rhetoric. I like the rhetoric. I like its theological subtlety, which is that most of the admirers of the King James Bible do it on the grounds of aesthetics. I am prepared to stand up and defend the King James Bible on the grounds of its theology. And I have not yet found a Bible that seems to me to compare with it in any way in theological subtlety. Clearly, archaeology has changed our views of certain things. Clearly, other texts have come to light, other copies of the Bible. But given that, I still think it's an extraordinary achievement. And I hope I made it clear tonight why I actually love the King James Bible, despite its 24,000 or so defects.
please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you. And thank you so much for turning out in a snowstorm.